What's up YouTube? This is Zack Schnepf, and today I'm going to be continuing my post-processing workflow tutorial series. In the last episode, I walked you through developing a single RAW file into two separate exposures, and in this episode we're going to be combining those two exposures here in Photoshop into our initial starting exposure. So again, this is a demonstration and I won't go into the same level of detail as I do in my more comprehensive tutorials on my website. I am currently producing a beginning Photoshop tutorial and it should be finished in late March or April of 2018. So let's jump in and get started. So my first step whenever I get to this point where I have multiple exposures as separate layers here in Photoshop, I want to evaluate what I have and what each exposure looks like, so I will preview them on and off with these little eyeballs here. And I start coming up with a game plan or a roadmap of how I want these two exposures blended together. Because again, my goal is I just want to start with a single layer that is basically like a starting exposure. If my camera would have been able to capture the full tonal range and dynamic range of this scene. So in this case you can see that we just have the light exposure showing, and there's definitely a lot of tones up in the sky that are too bright and I want to darken those down. If we look at this dark exposure, we can see this is definitely too dark down in the landmass, so I want to use definitely the lighter exposure for all of that, or at least most of that land mass. So the tricky thing is always to create this transition zone between the really bright sky up here and the land mass. So this kind of general area here is kind of what I call the transition zone. And that's one of the hardest things to do when you're blending exposures or when you're doing any kind of tonality work and you're trying to accentuate the light that's already there. So now that I've evaluated both exposures and kind of come up with a game plan, I kind of know where I want the tones from the dark exposure to be, where are the tones from the light exposure where I want those to be. Now I can start actually blending them together and creating my initial exposure or my combined exposure. So my first step, since most of the image is coming from this lighter exposure, well, let's show the dark exposure. I'll turn that back on, and let's add a layer mask to the dark exposure. And I'm also going to invert that mask and fill it with black, essentially, so that it's not showing at all now. So if I preview this eyeball button back and forth, you can see that it's not doing anything because that layer is hidden. So I'm just going to start with some basic freehand blending. Let me zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to start with just some basic freehand blending. I'll load the brush tool, and because I'm starting with a black mask here in this dark exposure layer, I'll be using white as my foreground color. You can see up here in the option bar for the brush tool up here that currently I have the opacity set to 20%, flow at 100%. You can quickly change the opacity just by hitting the number keys on your keyboard. So if I hit 5, it'll change it to 50, 220, 880, and so on and so forth. 0 is 100, and 1 is 10%. So I'm going to start just with 50% opacity and blend in, just freehand blend that sky in. And I will clean this all up later. This is really kind of rough draft mode. So let's make our initial pass. I'll just click up here, drag across, and one important thing is I have my hardness of my brush tool set to 0, so it has a nice soft feathered edge. It's extremely important. If you want nice soft blended brush strokes, you have to have your hardness turned down. So let's make another pass. And again, this is just basic freehand blending, and this is where you start with masking and using masks in Photoshop. So it doesn't look too bad already. Just with some freehand blending, you can see that we've increased the dynamic range and brought this back much more to how it was actually captured in the field. You know, your eye can see all these tones. I'm just recreating my own experience by overcoming the limitations of the camera that I was using at the time. So this is pretty good. I want to make one more pass at maybe a lower opacity, so I'm going to go in at 30% just along this transition area here. And it's actually fine if it gets a little bit too dark. I'll control those tones later. I'm just trying to create a good starting point. And again, we're in kind of rough draft mode here. And I'll even dip down into these hills to again create a transition zone. So again, I'm always trying to come up with the most pleasing tones that look the most natural when I'm blending exposures together. And a lot of times that just means creating those transition zones and making sure that the tones look very believable. So that was a good first rough draft pass with the brush tool. Now I'm going to switch my foreground color to black with my brush tool. I'm also going to reduce the radius. Again, you can do that with your square bracket keys on your keyboard. And I'm also going to load an opacity of 30%. And I'm going to go back over these areas, just again freehand blending. I'm not using any selections yet, just to remove a little bit of that darker exposure down here. And maybe up even into some of this transition zone up here. And let's go over this central tree. This is one of the main subjects of this photo, and I want this area to be a little bit lighter, but I want to be careful. See, that looks a little bit weird. I'm going to go back in my history. I don't want to do that. It kind of created a halo around it. Sometimes that's an effect that I want, but in this case, I don't want it to look haloed. So instead, I'm going to use a larger radius and go over this area in more of a general way, so that again it all blends together better and there's no abrupt tonal shifts that kind of give that illusion away. So really quickly, I'm going to take a look at the mask here and just kind of, this is what we did with our freehand blending so far to create this kind of rough draft. So I'm going to go over one more time with the tree and the surrounding tones. Again, I want to bring up those tones a little bit. And it looks pretty good. Again, this is kind of rough draft mode. We're just trying to get to a good starting point where we can flatten these two exposures down into one single exposure so we can move on to the rest of my workflow. So the next thing I want to do is to bring out some of the tones in this area, this darker area below the cloud. So if I turn off this darker exposure, you can see it's definitely darkening down the image quite a bit, and I want to lighten up these tones quite a bit. And again, this goes back to why I'm using that single raw file and created two separate exposures from that single raw file. Whenever you're working with a transition zone like this, if you're doing low opacity blending and you have two separate files where the skies don't line up, you're going to create some really weird kind of ghosting and weird artifacts. So that's one of the huge advantages, if you can, to work from a single raw file and just create two separate exposures. So in this case, I have tools that will help me accomplish what I'm trying to do here. So I want to go over this, and I could just go over it freehand blending, but I don't want to affect these lighter tones. I want to preserve these highlight tones up here, leave them as dark as they are. I just want to lighten up these darker tones. And there's a lot of great luminosity selection tools that would allow me to do that. So essentially, I'll be able to target certain tones, these darker tones here, and I'll be able to lighten them up while preserving the highlight tones. And the tools I use to do that are luminosity selections. And I also use Tony Kuiper's TKaction panel to load all of my selections. So this is the TKaction panel. It's basically a suite of different panels. You can see you have the rapid mask, the control panel here, and the actions panel. And there's even a layer mask panel down here. The ones I use the most are the rapid mask and the control panels. The TK panels here have really become the hub of my workflow in Photoshop. And I'm not being paid to say this, Tony's not paying me to say this, but I just think that it's such a powerful tool and it simplifies all these overly complicated processes. I was already using the majority of these tools and techniques already, but the panel just simplifies them and puts them essentially at your fingertips right here. So let me just start demonstrating how I use it. I will leave a link in the description to Tony's website where you can get this panel. It is an incredible resource, and again, like I said, it is the hub of my workflow. So again, I mentioned that I want to target these darker tones here below the bright sky, and I just want to bring those tones up. So the way I'll do that is using luminosity selections. You can see this section of Tony's panel is all about creating luminosity selections. Over here on the dark side, I'm going to start with a darks 3. So what that did is it created an alpha channel and it creates a selection based on the tonality of the image. And you can see all the darkest tones are now white or bright. And again, these are the tones that I'm trying to select. But the tones that I'm after aren't quite represented as well back here. They're a little bit too dark. So let's try a darks 2 instead. So I'll click on darks 2 and you can see that's pretty good. You can see the highlight tones up here are still black. And these tones are being selected much better, but they're still isolated from those highlight tones. So this is a much more useful luminosity selection. So within the panel, I can just hit selection if I have this rapid mask selected here. If I click on selection, it loads that alpha channel, the luminosity mask, as a selection. So I'll click back onto my mask over here on my dark exposure. I'm going to hide these marching ants. For me, that's a keyboard shortcut that I set up. I just use Command H. Sometimes that's set up to hide the program itself. You may have to go in and you'll see right here under Hide Extras, which those marching ants are considered extras. This will show you whatever your keyboard shortcut is set to. So in my case, it's Command H to hide those marching ants. You can find out what your keyboard shortcut is by, again, going into the View menu here and seeing what is listed right here. So again, I can toggle those on and off anytime just by hitting Command H. So now I'm going to go in with this with black as in my brush tool, and again I'm going to go in with a low opacity 30% brush and just try to recover some of those dark tones, just lighten them up a little bit. So I'll just go over this whole transition zone. And that looks good. Again, I'm just trying to create this transition zone. So this is before, and that's after. Very subtle difference. But again, this is just going to make it easier once I get further into my workflow. So I want to create the best blend possible now, and then I can continue on with my workflow. I'm going to make another pass down here. Again, very subtle. Right here as well. And let me preview before and after. Yeah, very subtle, but it looks good. So again, this is something I do pretty often. I will toggle on and off, kind of check how the progress is going. It's actually looking pretty smooth, and all these tones are coming together pretty well. I'm going to make one more pass down here below the cloud. just to kind of bring those tones more in line with where I think they should be. And let's preview one more time that dark exposure. And that's looking great. So again, I'm going to toggle those marching ants back on. And this is something, whenever you're using these luminosity selections, something I always forget. When I hide those marching ants, I always forget that I have a selection active. So I've just made it kind of habit to hit deselect as soon as I'm done with any luminosity selection. Because invariably what happens is you accidentally leave it up, and then you go to try to do something like load another mask or a adjustment layer or something, and it'll get loaded into there. It's not too big of a deal. That's the beauty of the history panel here. You can always just go back and redo it, but it is just kind of a nice habit to get into. I just deselect whenever I'm using a selection, whenever I'm done with that particular selection. So the next step is I just want to go over this one more time without a selection active, and I'm going to switch my foreground color to white really quick and go over this at a very low opacity. I'm going to set this to 20 and then go back over this to put some of those tones back a little bit. Just to kind of, I always like to go back and forth until I'm totally happy with how all the tones are looking and how this transition zone is looking in particular. So I'll even dip down into here just a little bit and overlap some of these hills, even though it's going to darken it a little bit. Again, it creates a more believable transition zone. Again, I don't want any harsh tonality shifts between here and this bright sky. So this is just one of those things I really, you don't have to go to this meticulous level of blending, but again, the more effort that you put in here into your blend, the easier your job is going to be when you start adding contrast and adjustment layers later down the line in the workflow. So it definitely pays dividends to invest that time here and create a really good blend with the strongest set of like transition zones possible. So this transition zone is looking very good now. I'm pretty happy with it. Let me just preview this on and off again. I might actually zoom in to this tree here. Again, this is a central character to my image, kind of one of the central subjects. And what I want to do, again, with no selections active, I want to come in here and just maybe freehand blend this tree. So if I preview this on and off, you can see it's being darkened just a little bit. I want to keep it from being darkened basically at all. One of my ideas for this image is for this tree really to pop out, and you saw that in the finished image. I want this tree to command a lot of attention. This is like the central subject of this image. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to set my opacity to 50%, and again, because we were starting with this dark exposure, I want to hide the dark exposure, so I'm using black. So I'm going to come in here and just freehand blend some of this tree so that it's not being darkened. So I'll just go over, and again, I'm being careful not to overlap and create halos around the tree, but I do want to make sure that this tree isn't being darkened. So that's looking pretty good. Again, at least as a good starting point, a rough draft, and from a single exposure kind of a point. The reason I want to flatten these down is I have some plans for this image later in the workflow. So in episode 3, we're going to be removing some of these man-made objects like these silos, tractor, maybe even like probably some of these phone poles that are back here. Because again, I want to create this illusion of this landscape without those man-made objects there. So again, that'll be in episode 3, cloning and doing pixel layer adjustments. Yep, so let me zoom out, try to evaluate how things are looking. And this is looking pretty good. This is about where I want to be at this point in the workflow. So now that I'm done with that first luminosity selection that I used, another good habit to get into is I like to clear out the channels to make way for if I'm going to do more luminosity selections later. So as I said before, I used to use luminosity selections before the panel was available. It was just a really tedious process and took forever. And it was also, everything was buried behind different panels. You had to go into the channels menu, do all these complicated like sets of hotkeys to get these selections built. So it really is amazing how easy it is now that the panel is available and you can just load them with a click of a button. And I will go into a lot more of how to use the panel, or how I use the panel, in later episodes. So once I get to this point and I'm happy with the way things are looking, let me just preview on and off. Yeah, I'm happy the way this looks. I've created a nice pleasing transition zone from the light layer, the light exposure here on the land, up to the darker exposure that I use for the sky. So at this point I'm ready to flatten this down and move on to the next part of my workflow. So again, you could just flatten it by heading up to layer and down to flatten image. But again, in the panel there is a button right up here for flatten. So I'll click on this, it'll flatten everything down, and now I can move on with my workflow. And that might seem really scary to some people since they just had that mask that was connected with the dark exposure and they did all that blending. You can leave those up and just continue on with your workflow. But again, because of the pixel layer adjustments that I'm going to do in the next episode with cloning and content-aware filling, I need to be starting from a single pixel layer to do that well. And there may be other ways of doing that. This is just the way that I really like to work. So here we are, we've got our flattened single pixel layer here. It's just called background. And now we're ready to move on to the next step of the workflow. So this is it for episode 2 and how to blend those two exposures together into this single final exposure, kind of the rough draft exposure, to then be able to move on with the workflow. So I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and remember to click the bell if you want to be notified when I release new videos. So again, in the next episode, episode 3, we are going to go into cloning all these man-made structures out of the image and how I go about approaching that process. So hopefully I'll see you in episode 3.